Hello and welcome to Texas Tracks and Taps. This is episode 11. I'm Graham.
I'm John.
And I'm Coy.
So today we're going to continue the little mini series that we started with our last episode, which we're diving into specific years in music that have really stood out to us and had a big impact both personally and on music in general. And today, John is going to talk about the year that he picked, which is 2001. But before we dive into that, I'm going to throw it to Coy, and he's going to tell us what brewery we are enjoying this evening.
Absolutely. So, yeah, we have chosen the fine folks at Community Beer Co. in Dallas, Texas. So we all have grabbed ours. We don't plan this ahead of time. So, of course, Graham and I got the haze, recreational grade haze, which when I saw it, and I think Graham was saying as well, cheers, fellas.
Cheers.
Yeah, I hadn't had that one, but I've had medical grade haze, fine hazy IPA, and I got to looking into it. And so this is actually the same recipe, same beer, that they had to change the name because the powers that be thought the general public wouldn't be able to tell from the name medical grade haze that there wasn't actual medicinal marijuana in the beer. But if you change it to recreational grade haze, suddenly that it's not murky anymore and makes sense that it's just beer. It's weird out there, guys. But yeah, so yeah, that's what we're enjoying. It's a great hazy, tropical, all the things that you get from a hazy. And then John, looks like you had the Mosaic IPA, which is I think kind of their flagship IPA.
Yeah, but it does say that it's tropical and floral, an American IPA as well, but very strong, 8.6% on this one. I don't know what is yours.
7.7.
I'll drink a little slower tonight. Thank you guys.
Yeah, that 8% will sneak up on you.
Yep. But I've had the opportunity to go out and visit Community Beers Brewery, and I think you guys have too. So.
Yeah, opened in 2013. I remember going to like their second anniversary. I think I should have got that glass. I think I still have the glass that you got from that anniversary party. Had their logo and a 2 on it. But yeah, I think I went to one of the like 3rd, 4th, 5th, somewhere around there, went again. It was definitely one of the first big ones in DFW, along with like RAR and some of the other ones we brought up in the past. So yeah, it was great when it came on the scene. They're still making great product. They've now relocated to a new spot from the original place that they had across from the highway from the American Airlines Center in the Victory area. So now they've got a kitchen tap room situation going on, really good food there, and lots of great outdoor space and indoor space. A great place to take the kids, the dog, let them run out, especially on a nice day. We're getting close to patio weather here in Texas. So might be a few storms before that or during that, but should have some nice days too. So, but yeah, great local brewery, and glad to have them a part of the show.
Cheers again.
Cheers again.
Yes, we love Community. Coy and I are going to just talk a little bit about some of the some notable Texas releases from the year that John has chosen. Again, that's 2001. So I have a few that I know we kind of discussed a little bit that Coy did not have on his list, but we had some overlap too. So I'm just going to highlight the ones that we didn't overlap on, and then Coy can talk about the others. Spoon from Austin released their 3rd album called Girls Can Tell, which, I mean, they've been making albums for quite some time. This was probably not their real big, I wouldn't say this was their big breakthrough album, but it's a very good album. Very solid all the way around. That's Baboon, which is a local DFW band. They released a live album called A Bum Note and a Bead of Sweat, which Baboon, they go way back in the area as well. And a lot of people around here know and love Baboon from back in the day. Midlake did not have a full-length LP out yet, but their first EP did come out. It's called Milkmaid Grand Army. That released in 2001. Robert Earl Keen, his album Gravitational Forces, which is his 9th album. released in 2001. Explosions in the Sky, Austin band, instrumental post-rock band, who a lot of people may not know they know, but they might recognize their sound if they heard them, if they ever watched the show Friday Night Lights, because they did, well, the movie Friday Night Lights, as well as a lot of the music for the show as well. They did the soundtrack. Very, very cool. Very good band. Well, I love quite a bit. And that was their second album. It's a really long title. Those who tell the truth shall die. Those who tell the truth shall live forever. That's the ones that I have. I think that Coy and I didn't overlap on. So I'm going to throw it to Coy now for the ones where we did overlap and a couple that I didn't have on my list.
Yeah. So we've talked about these local DFW bands before. Start with Deep Blue Something. They had their follow-up. It's their third album, but it was their follow-up to Home, which they released in 1994. So it's self-titled, Deep Blue Something. So, Home was their big explosion onto the scene in the 90s, became the, one-hit wonder that we all know. But then we talked about Toadies a lot too. Toadies, their album came out in 94 as well, or 93, but released locally in 93. I think got Interscope release in 94. And that was their big album, but they had a follow-up in 2001 as well called Hell Below Stars Above, which is a really great album. They still play a lot of the songs off of that when they play live, when like John and I saw them in December. We also talked about Old 97's Satellite Rides, another band we've mentioned quite a few times on this pod. This was a pretty big album for them as well. And then Pat Green I remember hearing this all over the place, but 3 Days, the album 3 Days, he released that in 2001. That's a pretty big one. George Strait, The Road Less Traveled, was released in 2001. It's kind of not in his prime time, but still, he was still really relevant and still making music, so had a lot of fans. So those were some of the other Texas bands that I had on my list, but did we leave any out, Graham?
Yeah, I did actually. I skipped over a couple.
I thought you had some more.
Yeah, Willie Nelson did release his album 49th album.
Isn't he up to like 89 or 90
Yeah.
something now? Yeah.
Dude has so many albums. But yeah, the Rainbow Connection, his 49th album, came out in 2001. And then also, I'm a homer for this band, obviously, because it's my big brother's band, but Live to Experience, their Texas Jerusalem Cross the Roads. That double album came out in 2001 as well. And I think a lot of people know that one out there.
Willie Nelson, one of the only artists to cover Kermit the Frog. It's a very small club.
Not too many people.
I think the Toadies have. No, I'm just kidding. But I would like to hear that. Well, what was going on in Georgia in 2001?
Well, lots of stuff was going on in Georgia. And one of the reasons why I picked this year, guys, is because it was a simpler time. It was pre-marriage, pre-kids. I was working in Atlanta in 2001, making decent money, living it up, drinking lots of beer and other things. And, the year started off extremely memorable. I think we all know what 2001 wound up being for all of us, but it was a pretty happy-go-lucky year in the beginning for Johnny. And one of the things that I was doing at the time was working in outside sales and hung out with a lot of my coworkers who also appreciated music quite a lot. They introduced me to a new band at the time that I'd never heard before by the name of the White Stripes. And there was an album that I remember one of my coworkers drew. In between appointments, he would throw it on CD in his car. And I was like, man, this album really rocks. Like, I had never really heard the songs before, but it really impacted me. And I quickly became like addicted to them. Like I was playing White Stripes all the time and I wanted more. I thought that was like their third album at the time. So I went back and got their previous albums as well. And so I just started playing White Stripes nonstop and probably was annoying a lot of people around me at the time. But White Blood Cells came out and, just to have two musicians make all of that beautiful music and noise and sound was just amazing to me. Like, I know that there had been bands that, were two pieces in the past, but man, did they, sound electric when you actually turned them on and cranked up the music. So you guys, I would assume, probably got into White Stripes in the early 2000s as well. Is that an album that kind of resonated with you guys?
Yeah, for me, my introduction was Fell in Love with a Girl on MTV. That music video was made with like Legos
Yep.
in stop motion. And I was just, in 2001 and the age I was, early 20s, I finally had, I think we've talked in like our origin story episode that I didn't have MTV growing up, but now I finally had MTV and it was still playing music. It was maybe 70-30 reality and music, but there was still some music out there. And yeah, I distinctly remember the first time I heard it and turned my head and then had to watch this pretty awesome visual music video. And the song was great too. So yeah, I immediately got that album on CD and started wearing it out. And then the subsequent releases by White Stripes and Jack White have been a big fan ever since that. Yeah, this was my introduction to them.
So Seven Nation Army, I think, was probably my introduction to them. I think I probably went back and checked out that debut album later on. Yeah. So I didn't ever own that album, but I do remember hearing that song, Dead Leaves in the Dirty Ground, and just realizing how different it sounded from anything else that was out there. It definitely had a unique quality to it. Again, like you said, I mean, just pretty crazy how they could make so much noise with just the two of them and sound so good, But yeah, that was definitely a big one. I would say I'm probably, and I think this album is on your list as well, John, that I was more into The Strokes, their debut album, which also released in 2001. But again, I mean, they're both very, very good records.
Yeah, Strokes. I mean, it was their debut, and the big song off of, well, actually, there were two or three big songs, but the really big one, I think, was Last Night, that just rocked on every radio station that year. It was really a great year for rock and roll. I know you guys are going to talk about a couple other genres that it was a great year for. Like, there's some years like in the 90s that are just phenomenal where you've got, literally like 3-4 dozen fantastic albums that came out. And I never thought, when I first picked 2001 that this was going to be like those, but it really was. There were some genres both in rock and roll, and I think, I don't want to steal your thunder. I'll let you talk about the genres you're going to talk about, but there was really an evolution of music. Some bands that were coming out that were new, and definitely Strokes were one of them. Another one that really just kind of blew my mind. I remember the video when System of a Down and Toxicity came out. That wasn't their debut album. It's actually their second album. But hearing Chop Suey, man, I was like, there's nothing like this. Like, even Rage had been out for years, for over a decade at that point. But man, even Rage Against the Machine didn't play like those guys in System of a Down. And so it was so unique and so hard, but also melodic. Serge's voice was just, it's incredible. It still is incredible today. But, another song, the title track Toxicity came out, I think actually after Chop Suey did, but that was a great album that I had on my list.
That one went certified platinum.
System of a Down.
Sold a ton of records.
Yeah. And in Georgia, Coy, you were asking me about what's going on in Georgia. There were definitely some Georgia bands that were putting out some new music in 2001. So the first one that I've got on my list for Georgia bands were the Black Crowes. And, none of these are debuts, but new albums that were coming out. Lions doesn't get the credit that I think some of the other albums from the Black Crowes gets, but front to back, I personally think that's like my favorite Black Crowes album. And if you probably are familiar with the song Soul Singing, because I think that was the big release that year that a lot of people heard, but two songs that I personally love. Have you ever heard the song Lickin' by Black Crowes?
No.
The intro guitar to that is just so neat and so hard, and it's a great song. And then Greasy Grass River is another one, another great track on that album. You know, the godfathers of Georgia rock and roll and music, REM, had Reveal come out that year as well, which was quite different album than, you know, their previous albums. They were very much an experimentation band and kind of change things up album after album. But Imitation of Life was the big hit off of that particular album. But All the Way to Reno and She Just Wants to Be, two other great tracks off of that album. And then in 2000, you know, I said I was working and I was making decent money. I finally was past the college stage where I had no money, and I was able to actually go to concerts again. And one of the bands that I saw for the first time was a jam band called Widespread Panic. And the masses call them a jam band. I would call them a rock and roll blues band. But they actually put out their 7th album, which was called Don't Tell the Band. And I was able to actually catch them for the first time in my life in Atlanta at Phillips Arena. So, and I think I've seen them now 6 or 7 times. Through the years, I've seen them all over the place. But a couple tracks on that one that I really like were Imitation Leather Shoes, the title track, Don't Tell the Band. And then there's a song called Little Lily. And we almost named our daughter Lily after that song.
Wow.
Almost. We didn't name her Lily after all, but it was definitely at the top of the list because of that song. So outside of that, you know, there were a lot of great albums. When you actually look down the list of some of the artists that, you know, put out albums that year, it really was an amazing year. I think Jack Johnson was another one, had a debut album, Brushfire Fairy Tales, which I think when it first came out didn't get the notoriety that it did after his 2nd or 3rd album hit. But, you know, years later, decades later, it definitely is one of those indie folk albums that a lot of artists kind of reach back to and say that inspired them. But yeah, anything you guys got on your list? Because I still have like 30 on.
I'll just point out something because you've touched on it a little bit already, which is that I feel like 2001 had more in common with 1991 than I realized until, you know, we talked about 1991 in the last episode, and now we're talking about 2001. And it was a time when rock had kind of like had this great run in the 90s. And then, I mean, you can tie it to Woodstock 99 and Limp Bizkit, and maybe it's unfair to put it all on them, but rock kind of, you know, wasn't it. I mean, I think people even said like rock is dead, like, you know, in the late 90s, which was crazy considering all the momentum it had, especially grunge and alternative. So pop took over again. And so it was kind of like how in the 80s, pop was huge towards the end of the 80s, and then grunge and alternative came in. And I mean, rock was big in the 80s too, but there was this big transformation. Well, now pop was taking over again, and boy bands were the big deal. I mean, NSYNC had a Celebrity came out, which was their follow-up to No Strings Attached, and they were one of the biggest grossing tours of the year, along with Backstreet Boys. Janet Jackson, All For You, came out in 2001. She was also one of the big tours of the year. But then you also had Journey put out a new album in 2001, within the first one without Steve Perry. Yeah, so, and they were touring again. Aerosmith released a new album and a greatest hits album in 2001, and were also in one of the largest tours of 2001. U2 was the biggest tour in 2001. I saw them, I think we've talked about in the past, I saw them 3 times on that tour. Oh yeah, drink, Coy's talking, or Graham or something.
The U2 drinking game.
I had to figure out a way to work them in. And since that All That You Can't Leave Behind came out in 2000, I had to talk about how the Elevation tour for that supported that album went into 2001 and was the biggest tour of the year. But yeah, so you had kind of these older rock bands, and you had the new metal stuff, and but then you started to get these kind of new indie rock, you know, for lack of a better word, like the Strokes and the White Stripes. And I have on here Pete Yorn, Music for the Morning After. That was one of my favorite albums of 2001. And I saw him live, and he was incredible live. 2001's a pretty important year for a specific genre of rock that's really it's its third wave. There was an 80s and a 90s wave of it, but the third wave was arguably maybe the biggest as far as how mainstream it got. And for the next decade or so, kind of like the way grunge took off for a decade or so, you had, almost the rebirth of emo in 2001 with some really big releases. So I know, Graham, you have some of these albums on your list, and I have a few as well.
So I'm going to start with what I would say is probably the most important one, at least in my opinion. But I think, that opinion is probably shared by a lot of people out there. But Jimmy Eat World released what was titled Bleed American, and then after 2011 rescinded, and it was called just a self-titled album. But they've since gone back and added the Bleed American title back in, but they just wanted to be sensitive in the wake of 9/11. But yeah, that album, I mean, Clarity for me was the one, I think for you too, Julio, that, where we discovered Jimmy Eat World and we're blown away. But Bleed American is the one that catapulted them into another stratosphere. And, obviously the two huge singles off there were Sweetness and The Middle. But a fantastic album. I mean, there's not a bad song on it. I mean, from beginning to end for me. And then the other one, which was really, I think, important too, and really big in my world, was Dashboard Confessional, The Places You've Come to Fear the Most, is the second studio album, although it's the first studio album from Dashboard Confessional is actually, like, the second one, The Places You've Come to Fear the Most, has a lot of the same songs, because I think that one was, a major label release, whereas the first one was a smaller indie label. And so a lot of those songs from the first one carried over onto other Places You've Come to Fear the Most. But I think that one really kind of, I mean, you had some artists before this kind of doing the acoustic kind of singer-songwriter emo. Bright Eyes comes to mind. I mean, they were already around, and there's a couple others, but I think this really brought that part of emo, that side of emo, into the mainstream, primarily from their big hit Screaming Infidelities, which was huge. But yeah, those are the two third wave emo albums, that I had on my list.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up.
I will actually mention one more, because this, to me, it's pretty interesting. Also, Further Seems Forever.
Yeah, that's where I was going. I'm
Their
glad you
album,
brought up
Limited
Dashboard.
Down, and was also released in 2001, which is the band that Chris Carrabba, who is Dashboard Confessional, that was the band he was in before he eventually left and went only solo. Not only solo, but was solo for a little bit, and then eventually got a band again, and it was Dashboard. But that album it's really, really good too. Like that album is also from beginning to end. There's not a bad song, and I think it definitely had a big influence, on a lot of other bands that came after.
Yeah, I was going to say Further Seems Forever. He had already left the band, but he came back to record that album, which is The Moon Is Down. So he had both that Further Seems Forever album and Dashboard Confessional album came out in 2001. Other notable emo releases: Thrice, Identity Crisis; Brand New, Your Favorite Weapon, which was one of my favorite emo bands and albums from that era. Something Corporate had the Audio Boxer EP, which was, they were such a great band because they had a piano player, singer, and it was emo punk. It was just they were a little different. And I remember when I first heard their that EP, I was like, okay, this is different. This is pretty cool. Other ones that are huge for the scene and what would happen for the next decade or so: The Movie Life Has a Gambling Problem EP; Death Cab for Cuties, the photo album, technically falls under that, although it could also be indie rock. They're one of the few bands that can kind of straddle both of those worlds. Saves the Day, Stay What You Are. And biggest one I want to mention, we've named the big ones, but Thursday Full Collapse is a huge album that came out for that genre in 2001. And I've been listening to it today just to get me back in that state of mind that I was in 2001, and just like the really hearing all these awesome emo rock albums for the first time, and not knowing like how the next, almost 10 years or so, there were going to be so many great follow-ups from these guys, but also these newer bands. It led the way for My Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco. So many came after in the next few years, but these were the ones that really exploded onto the scene in 2001.
Yeah, I think, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying about how it kind of, has some similarities to 91. It's like you really had a lot of different branches of rock and roll just really coming into their own, really like establishing their own identity, within, under the rock umbrella. And, another one I think that it was a really good year for, maybe not to the level of the third wave emo, but alt country had a lot of important and very fantastic releases in 2001. Whiskey Town, their third and final album, Pneumonia, came out, but also it's kind of like the whole Chris Carrabba thing. Ryan Adams' first, or not first, but his second solo album also came out in 2001 as well. And I not discovered, but I remember going into, it was Borders at the time, and they had both albums, like, at one of the listening stations. And I wasn't very familiar with Ryan Adams at the time. I knew Whiskey Town from the one song that I had heard on the radio, which was 16 Days, and I liked that song. But when I went in there and listened to both those albums and then realized, oh, this is the same guy that, is the front man in this band, and this is a solo album, and put the two together, and then we fell in love with both those records and took both of them home that day. But yeah, those were both, I think, very influential in the alt country genre. Drive-By Truckers also put out their third album, which I wouldn't say it was it was not a huge commercial success, but lauded by critics.
Fantastic album. Fantastic album. So
this is actually pre-Isbell. This was right before he joined the band that year after this album came out. So that's another one that, I think was big as well. And then obviously too, you have, which this album is kind of, Wilco was known, I think, before this as an alt country band, but when this album came out, it kind of put them into a whole nother realm. And that's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. It's a lot more experimental and atmospheric than their previous work, but still maintained some of that alt countryness and had some really catchy tunes on it. But this album the recording of it was filled with a lot of turmoil. The record company Reprise didn't like the album and refused to release it. So they ended up signing with Nonesuch. There was a lot of tension between Jay Bennett, who was a pretty important member of the band, and Jeff Tweedy. And Jay actually ended up leaving the band, I'm pretty sure amidst the recording of it, or at least after the recording of it. And then Tweedy also was suffering from substance abuse issues at the time as well. This was actually documented in the documentary I'm Trying to Break Your Heart. If you haven't seen that and you like that kind of stuff, rock and roll documentaries, it's a really, really great one.
Yeah, I watched I'm Trying to Break Your Heart and Some Kind of Monster, that Metallica documentary. I watched those, I think, both around this time. And both of those are like, yeah, you want to see some highly dysfunctional bands that somehow make some pretty amazing albums. Those are two of my favorite music documentaries.
For sure.
Graham, you brought up Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. Some significance of that album is that it actually came out on 9/11. So obviously, all of the tragedy around 9/11 took precedence over anything in the music world. Although the music world rallied together immediately afterwards, and it was really amazing some of the music that came out post 9/11 that had to do with the tragedy. But another album that actually, I think there were two others that came out that day. I'll have to throw it to you guys for the other one, but Jay-Z, The Blueprint, was actually released on 9/11 as well. What was the other one?
Ben Folds' first solo album.
Yeah,
that's right.
Rock in the Suburbs, and as well as POD's Satellite also came on. That was a huge album for them. Yeah, there were actually quite a few. Those are the ones that stand out. But yeah, and we kind of get into that in our episode we have about activism music, how this was, it is weird. The year started out very carefree. By the end of the year, was the opposite of that. And then you're going to see the music for the rest of the decade shaped by not just the events of 9/11 and how we, it unified us, but then some of the ways that, the fallout of 9/11, and then you started to see like, some good music made, and you can go listen to that episode where we talk more about that. But very interesting how impactful this year was, not just with all the new music coming out, but just with the events that happened that year too, for sure.
Throw another one out there that hasn't been mentioned yet, which would be a shame if we didn't, and that's Bob Dylan's Love and Theft, his 30th album, which I think was definitely like kind of not that Bob Dylan ever went away. I mean, he was always there, but like it was a pretty big kind of comeback album for him, where like I think a lot of younger people, I think, discovered Bob Dylan with this record who, didn't know him before, and thankfully that's happening again with the release of this biopic about Dylan. Like my second daughter, who's 21, she's like all about Bob Dylan now, and digging into his stuff, which is really cool. But yeah, that one went gold. It peaked at number 5 on the Billboard 200, so pretty big hit for him.
Yeah, there were a ton others. Like I still have like a huge list to roll through.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton we haven't mentioned yet. I mean,
Radiohead,
Amnesiac,
yeah,
great one.
Tool,
Letter Alice, yeah, which I think Tool, was definitely having a huge influence and kind of a directional change in the metal, genre as well. Yeah, just bring more of an artistic sensibility, and kind of going back to that progressive kind of metal sound, but definitely just had their own thing going and didn't sound like anything else. They won a Grammy actually for that, not for the album, but for best metal performance, and it debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and went triple platinum. So yeah, that was a huge album. I mean, especially when you think about that, the genre that it's in and being metal, like that. Metal albums don't typically do that, but it was such a crossover, that people who were fans of all kinds of genres, I think, were into Tool. So,
well, I'll loop back, Coy, and let you know it was the first time that I saw U2 that year as well.
Nice. First out of how many?
First out of 2.
2. Okay.
Yeah. Saw him in Atlanta in 2001, and then I think I caught him in Phoenix probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So, yeah, so I pulled up the concerts that I'd actually gone to that year as well. I got to see Trisha Yearwood. I think isn't she married to Garth Brooks these days?
I know she was at one point.
And then I got to see, I forget his name because he's unfortunately no longer with us, but Hey Now, You're an All-Star.
Smash Mouth.
Yeah, Smash Mouth.
Saw Smash Mouth in 2001.
They also had an album in 2001.
Yes.
Oh, they did? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I know that I had tickets to see Jimmy Eat World, that show, and Graham did too, and at Gypsy Tea Room in Dallas, and that show got postponed due to 9/11. But I remember the first show I saw after 9/11 was Cake. And it was the first time I had seen Cake, but it was at the Bronco Bowl, which we've talked about before. And it was a great show, but I remember how eerie it felt that this many people were, it's like the first show after COVID. Now we have like this whole other perspective on, public gatherings, but it was weird, like it was, I want to say less than a week after. And, it was like we wanted to be there. We wanted to be having a normal, life, but it's weird because something so crazy had just happened. Yeah. But Cake had an album come out in 2001 as well, Comfort Eagle, which Short Skirt Long Jacket was the huge hit off of that one. You felt like you heard that everywhere. But yeah, I think I might have seen Creed right around that time. It might have been more into 2002, but I had friends who, Graham, you might have been at that Creed show.
I think so. Oleander was on that bill as well, I think.
Wait. Did you both just publicly...
Oleander had a record.
So wait, no, listen.
That's
okay.
You both publicly said you saw Creed.
By this time I had
100%.
realized I had realized that I was not a Creed fan. Now, I will say, like, that first album, I did get into that. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna own up to that.
My
By
Own
this time,
Prison.
I had disowned them. But the only reason I went to that show is because I had just started going out with a girl who I had a crush on for a long time. And her and her friends, were going to the show. And so I got myself a ticket and went. And she subsequently broke up with me at the concert. So it lasted about a week.
Insult to injury.
So yeah, exactly. So I
Yeah.
had some very, very bad memory. But
I was the last of my friend group to get into Creed. I actively resisted it, and then got to the point where I was like, I'm being ridiculous, and gave, My Own Prison a chance. And I was like, yeah, it's not bad. It's good. And then got really into Human Clay, the next one that had, Higher on it. So by the time Weathered came out, I think I hadn't seen them live. And so I had a friend who's like, let's go see them. And that might have been when I broke up with Creed, was at that show. Like, it was fine. It was just like, I was like, I don't think I've got much left in the tank for Creed. No offense to Creed fans or the band.
Well, not a lot of people are going to see this.
But yeah, it's not quite top.
Can you share your Creed tattoos? Like, I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, let me go get one real quick and then I'll share it. I know I saw Ben Folds in 2002, and then like within a week I saw Travis in 2002. It was both at the Red Jacket in Dallas, which is no longer with us.
Yeah.
But those were both because they had these 2001 releases, Ben Folds Rockin' the Suburbs and Travis's The Invisible Band, which I was a huge fan of. The Man Who, the album that Travis released before that. And I thought Invisible Band was even better album. And this was, I think, peak Travis for me, although I liked their earlier stuff, and I've liked stuff that they've come out with. Their newest album is really good.
Yeah.
And Graham and I just saw them live a few months ago, and they hold up. Travis is still really, really good.
Yeah, Invisible Band's on my list. I mean, you have Sing and Sigh.
Mm-hmm.
Those two singles, those two hits off that one. Great songs, but there's a lot more there that's really good as well if you dive into it.
Yeah.
Spent 4 weeks at the top of the UK album charts. In 4 weeks, it sold more copies than The Man Who sold in 6 months. Pretty impressive. I don't know that we mentioned, I think you did mention the Shins briefly, but their album was Oh Inverted World, their debut album. And that was a big one too for the indie scene. A lot of people found them, I think, like I did, which was via the Garden State soundtrack.
Yeah, which was 2002, I think, is when that movie came out. But yeah, why am I blanking on the name of that song?
New Slang.
New Slang, yeah. New Slang was featured had a pretty great scene that song was featured in the movie. And then, yeah, I think that's how I was introduced to them, but not in 2001, but 2002. A lot of these, actually, when I look at them, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I heard them about a year after they came out. Not all. A lot of them I did hear right away, but some of them I was like, oh, that came out in 2001? Because I feel like I got into it a little bit later. That's how it was with music back then. We didn't have like everything at our fingertips like we do now.
Yeah, for sure. John, I'm surprised you haven't mentioned Everyday yet.
Yeah, I know. It's on my list still.
I was waiting.
I mean, Dave Matthews, yeah, I mean, great album. Another one that's actually huge, and they've been, very influential over the past 20, 25 years is Blink-182. Take Your Pants Off and Jacket. Jacket.
Take off your pants. And
like your jacket that you're wearing.
Yeah, that's exactly what they meant.
Off your pants and jacket.
Two guys that fronted other bands that, one's not really a solo album, but Perry Farrell put out his debut solo album, which was called Song Yet to Be Sung. And I actually remember I think I bought the tape at a Tower Records in Atlanta, outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I was all excited because, obviously he fronted Jane's Addiction, but another one was Joe Strummer and the Mescaleros. And I didn't really discover, I knew the Clash and I'd listened to them for years, but I never listened to the Mescaleros until much later. But they put out their second album that year, Global A Go-Go, and it's definitely worth checking out if you haven't listened to that album. Very good album.
I'll check it out.
They are
Another one
and
that's
more.
yeah, another one is, kind of just speaking of like kind of side projects, so to speak. The frontman from Blur,
Yeah.
Damon Albarn, he formed Gorillaz, which was a big collaborative project, and their debut album came out in 2001 as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, the huge hit off of that is Clint Eastwood, but there's a lot of good stuff on that record as well, and their subsequent albums.
Yeah.
From then on.
Girls were huge. I was definitely really into them. It was probably like my most eclectic time and like for the rest of my life. But like I remember like being very much into rock until around this time, and I started getting into a lot of other stuff. And Gorillaz is alternative, but it's got beats and it's incorporating a lot of other stuff. And Basement Jaxx is another band that came out with an album called Rudy. The big track off of that was called Where's Your Head At? And I remember the first time I heard that, I was just like, what is this? This is cool and more electronic. And then NERD came out with In Search Of in 2001. That is Pharrell.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that was his band. And that kind of was the first time I ever heard Pharrell before he was Pharrell. It was NERD. And then I was like, oh, this guy from NERD is now one of the most famous producers in the world.
I think I left it off my list, but didn't Daft Punk?
Mm-hmm.
They did.
Yeah,
That's an album.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. But
I don't know if it was one of their best albums, but it was still a Daft Punk album. So, I mean,
for sure.
Geez. I mean,
There's a
so
few
many.
country ones that I don't think we've mentioned. So I'll say Alison Krauss and Union Station, new favorite. The Oh Brother Where Art Thou soundtrack had come out the year before, and then this one came out in 2001. Union Station was basically the singing band, the band and the singers that were George Clooney and the other guys in the movie. So this was a great album. The song Lucky One I was obsessed with that.
It's
such a great album.
Great album. She was on that. She was on it too. Like just awesome.
Yeah, she was one of the songs.
Along with piggyback on that, Jillian Welch. She had also on my list.
Yep.
Her album Revelator that came out that year is fantastic, and she was also part of that soundtrack.
Dolly Parton also had an album in which she was nominated, I think, for 2 Grammys and won one of them for Best Female Performance in Country. That album's called Little Sparrow. But I know from a pop perspective, there were a ton of pop acts at this time.
Garth Brooks.
Garth Brooks is the other one. Yeah, that's right.
Scarecrow.
That's right, Scarecrow. Yep.
Well, and then we haven't mentioned this one, which I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Weezer albums, but the Green Album came out in 2001, which it's a good album. It's a fun album. I think it was them kind of trying to recapture, a little more of what they had on the Blue album, because initially their second album, I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. Help me out.
The Blue album?
No, second album.
Pinkerton.
Pinkerton.
Yeah.
It was commercially kind of a disappointment and
critically successful.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people didn't really warm up to it till later on. I mean, I liked it right away, but a lot of people didn't because it was a lot different from Blue, and I think they were just expecting another Blue. The Green Album, I think, had a lot more in common with Blue. Just kind of the big fun, just
Hash Pipe's a fun song.
Yeah. I didn't love that one as much as it came out, but I've since come to appreciate it and like it a whole lot.
But I think Island in the Sun was
on that too.
Was off of that.
It's up there for me. Like they're older. The older their stuff is, the higher up on my list it is. Although I enjoy even their newer stuff.
Yeah.
But Tenacious D also came out in 2001, and so that one of my favorite concerts that I've ever been to was Jimmy Eat World, Tenacious D, and Weezer. And I don't think another lineup will come close to that for me, as far as like they were all, in their prime, huge successful albums that they were supporting on that tour. And so that was a really fun time. 311, kind of in the same vein, I feel like, of that Weezer album, as far as like just kind of vibey, good feeling music. From Chaos was released. So Amber's the big track off of that one that I think everyone knows of from 311.
Yeah, I'll mention this one, even though for me personally, like it's not something that's really in my wheelhouse. I don't know that it's in any of our wheelhouse, but I know it was a huge album, and I know that a lot of people are really into this artist, and I definitely have respect for this artist and understand her importance, in the music world, and that's Bjork. She released Vespertine, her fourth album, which reached 19 on the Billboard 200. So, I didn't realize that, but it's pretty big.
You mentioned earlier the Blink-182. I think along in that vein, Sum 41's All Killer No Filler also came out in 2001, and that was huge. It was like you had your pop punk and you had emo, and like those were like the main lanes. And there was, there's some crossover even there. They're very much cousins, if not siblings. Alien Ant Farm Anthology with the Smooth Criminal remake was a pretty huge track in 2001. That was another one that was everyone.
You could not get away from that song.
You could not get away from it. No.
I've got a few kind of maybe a little bit lesser known ones, but albums that I think were really good, and I think probably critical successes, maybe not as much as commercial successes, but Low. I don't know if either of y'all familiar with them. They released Things We Lost in the Fire, which is a fantastic album. Really like that record a lot. Broken Social Scene, which was again kind of another like collaborative kind of super group, a bunch of guys from a bunch of different other bands. Their debut album came out called Feel Good Lost. Red House Painters, who were slowcore / sadcore pioneers. Their sixth album, Old Ramone, came out. I mean, there's just a lot. Lucero, another all-country band, their second record, which is really good. Lucinda Williams, probably her biggest, I think, most successful probably single came off her album Essence, which is her sixth album, and that's Car Wheels on a Gravel Road. I think that's probably one of her biggest selling singles of all time.
You're forgetting the indie group Sugar Ray. They came out with Sugar Ray in 2001, which the song When It's Over, I heard Mark McGrath call it They're With or Without You. Is it, or at least that's the vibe they were going for, was that relationship of like, love and can't stay together, can't be apart. But that song was everywhere as well. I remember hearing that all over the place.
I have to say With or Without You is a hell of a lot better
than When It's Over. I don't know. No Doubt. We hadn't said No Doubt. Rocksteady came out in 2001 as well. I saw them open for U2 on the Elevation tour, and then went and saw them headline at the Bronco Bowl during that album.
That did win a Grammy for Best Pop Vocal Album.
Yeah, that was a huge, huge album.
The National, who would go on to later success, released their debut album, which kind of was definitely at the time very under the radar, but they got big a couple albums later.
I mentioned Dolly, but check out all these women, especially in pop. Eve came out with Scorpion, which had Gwen Stefani on a track on that one. They're the big single off of that one. Janet Jackson, All For You. Alicia Keys' song in A minor, I believe that was her debut, and that exploded on the scene as well. Britney had the self-titled Britney album, which had a lot of huge hits like Slave For You and stuff like that on there. Shakira, I think her first big album was 2001, Laundry Service. Pink, Misunderstood. Missy Elliott, which is So Addictive, which had Get Your Freak On. Michelle Branch, The Spirit Room, which had Everywhere and Goodbye to You on it. So yeah, I mean, the ladies were all over the place. And then there's these Texas women that we forgot to mention. We were talking about Texas. Destiny's Child had Survivor in 2000.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, which was another huge.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it was just, music was really, I think, just doing well just across all genres in 2001.
And did not mean to leave out J-Lo. Jennifer Lopez had the album J-Lo in 2001, which is another big one. And then, do you guys know Katie Hudson? Because she released an album.
Like Kate Hudson?
No, Katie Hudson, Katy Hudson. You
Hmm.
might know her.
Wait. Is this
Yeah, Graham.
Katy Perry?
So yeah, this was a contemporary
Christian album?
It was a Christian album.
Yeah.
Katie Hudson, that came out in 2001, self-titled. We would not really hear that album, but we would later hear a lot from Katy Perry.
Yeah, I actually just learned this recently, and I actually went and like pulled that album up and listened to a little bit of it. Not very much because I couldn't take much of it. It's not good. I'm not gonna lie, but
I think
at
she
least
was in it.
I didn't enjoy it. I didn't like it, so I didn't listen to very much of it. But I found it really fascinating.
I want to say it's
Pointed out as
POD.
a Christian artist.
We were talking about POD earlier. I think there's a POD video that she is in
I don't know.
before she's Katy Perry, but I could be wrong on that. I have to go back to the archives for that one. American Hi-Fi was another one that was pretty big that year as far as like kind of more the pop punk alternative.
A couple more indie, kind of alt rock. Elbow. Probably some Elbow fans out there. They released their debut, Asleep in the Back. It's a really good band. Mogwai, who is a very good post-rock act. They released their third album, Rock Action, which is a really good one.
Nice.
Mark Lanigan, lead singer of the Screaming Trees.
Yeah,
had
I
a-
saw that one. I figured you'd bring that one up. That's why I didn't put it on those.
I don't think we mentioned John Mayer, Room for Squares.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That's a pretty big one for
Yeah.
someone that we hear a
Definitely.
lot more from in the coming years of the 2000s. Modest Mouse had 2 albums come out in 2001, which I thought was interesting. I didn't catch these in 2001. It wasn't until they got a little bigger later in the decade that I went back and discovered their earlier stuff. But Sad Sappy Sucker and Everywhere and His Nasty Parlor Tricks both came out that year. Shout out to Semisonic, one of my favorite bands from the late 90s, had a All About Chemistry came out in 2001, which was their follow-up to the big one that they had in the late 90s. I personally love that album. I don't think it was as good as the one before it, but I was such a fan of theirs. I was just happy to get more Semisonic music.
I have the same feeling about this album, which is Built to Spill, Ancient Melodies of the Future. It's very good. It's their 5th album, but it wasn't quite as good as their 4th album, Keep It Like a Secret, which was a phenomenal record.
What about with artists that we lost in 2001?
Dude, I remember where I was when I saw on the news that we had lost George Harrison in 2001.
Where were you?
I was in Galveston, I believe, going on a trip with my girlfriend and her family, her extended family. They do a Dickens type Christmas down there. And so we were all geared up to go participate in that and had the TV on in the hotel room, and that came on, and her uncle was a really big Beatles fan. So I just remember him being like bummed the whole day. But I mean, yeah, it was just like, you were like, man, and then there were 2, but we still have those 2 after, 20 plus years.
We do, yeah. It was definitely sad to lose George, because I think all of us still had in our minds that there was going to be some sort of reunion potentially at some point, or they were, the surviving members of the Beatles were going to come together, but that kind of erased those thoughts. But yeah, it was definitely sad. I think he was the biggest name, although we lost lots of artists and don't want to take away from any of those artists, but he was definitely one of the biggest names that was on the list in 2001. We were bantering back and forth about this, before we flipped record on, but Joey Ramone was another big one. Losing him from the Ramones, one of the founding members of the Ramones. I remember that one actually hit me, I think, as hard, if not harder, than George Harrison when I learned of that. And just a lot of people in the rock community coming together for, his funeral. I believe it was in Los Angeles where he's buried. But
you 2 would end up doing a tribute to him at shows on that tour after he passed. They would specifically dedicate, can't remember exactly which song it was, to Joey Ramone.
In a little while.
What was it?
In a little while.
Oh yeah, that's right. And then I think the next album, or maybe it was the one after that, they ended up writing the song
Well-
about Joey Ramone. I mean, they were the Ramones were hugely influential on Bono and U2, and so yeah, that was something where you saw it just pour out into the other areas of music, how impactful it was. We didn't mention her earlier. She had an album that came out in July of 2001, and she died in August of 2001. But that's Aaliyah. And yeah, I mean, I think she was in a movie that was at the Queen of the Damned. It was like the Anne Rice vampire movie. She was set to definitely take off, and that was just one of those tragic, like, life's cut way too short, right when she was about to explode.
Yeah, and she was actually in that circle of Missy Elliott. You mentioned her earlier, and Timberland. She was kind of in those circles and really young. I think she was only like 22 when she passed away, but made a real quick and powerful impact for sure in both movies and music.
Other people we lost: John Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas, Chet Atkins, John Lee Hooker, blues legend, and Perry Como are some of the other ones that I mentioned. And I feel like I do remember like it feeling like a year we lost a lot of, like, even if it wasn't people I listened to their music, I knew all of the names,
Yeah,
I knew those people,
for sure.
A couple others that I had on my list that we lost before we wrap up here. John Fahey, big guitarist. I don't think we mentioned him earlier. O.C. Smith, who was kind of a R&B singer, and then Leon Wilkerson, who was the bassist for Leonard Skinner. We lost him as well that year. So
I'm gonna throw one at you. We definitely lost a lot of great musicians. We had one born in 2001. I mean, we had more than one, but I made note of one specifically because I was like, oh, really? And I know that I was going to give you guys a chance to guess who it might be.
okay, I'm gonna guess Sabrina Carpenter.
It's a good guess. She's 1999, so she's just a little older than this person. Graham looks like he doesn't have a guess at all, but in December of 2001, Billie Eilish made her debut in the world.
Yeah, I should have known that.
We'd have to wait a little bit longer to hear her music.
When was she born? What day?
I think it's December 18th. I know it's in December.
Okay.
So barely made
Yeah.
2001.
Good
It's a
tribute.
big one though.
Like it.
Yeah. One other musical note for 2001, the movie Moulin Rouge came out in 2001, which is, I don't remember there being many like this, but now I feel like there's a lot of them. But it's even a genre I didn't realize the name for it, but it's called jukebox musical, where it's just takes like existing songs and incorporates them into the musical. So yeah, I remember just being like, this is visually a different movie, but also I had not heard them take like, pop and rock and famous songs and incorporate it into the storyline of the movie. That soundtrack I feel like was also pretty big in 2001. They released a volume 2 in 2002.
Yeah.
And then on television, I have to give a shout out to Buffy the Vampire Slayer's Once More with Feeling musical episode. Its soundtrack album would not release until 2002, but I can tell you there were those of us who had ripped really bad quality versions off of the television broadcast and edited it together and shared it on file sharing websites and MySpace and burned CDs of that soundtrack before the actual produced version came out in 2002. But that was a big deal for some of us nerds.
All right. Very well. Anything else on 2001 before we close it out?
I'll just say that if you want to know more about emo in 2001, and also before and after, go to your local library or Audible or wherever you get your books. There's a book called Where Are Your Boys Tonight by Chris Payne that is a really great oral history of emo, especially this era, the third wave of emo. And yeah, if you want to take a real deep dive into it, I can't recommend that book enough. It's very good. And an oral history just means it's basically they just take quotes from interviews, or it's not told in like a narrative style. It's just chronologically, he just puts a quote. So you're hearing like the stories from the mouths of the people that were eyewitnesses or in the bands or
Can you back up and explain to this generation what a library actually is?
No.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm gonna put a plug in for something. It's called the Libby app, which is a library app. You can access, audio versions or digital versions, both audio and text digital versions of stuff from your local library. So, if your kids don't want to actually get out and go to the actual library, check out the Libby app. It's worth it.
And I will say, if you're listening to us on Spotify, for example, if you're paying premium for Spotify already, like I am, because you need all the different accounts for your family, a lot of audiobooks are available with your premium subscription. And I think this is one of them, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? I think I saw that it was available.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So I know I have like the Audible credits, and you get like one a month. And I'm always like, oh, I'll spend my credit on this, but then I go like, oh, I wonder, and I'll look at Spotify and they'll have it included. And so now I end up with like, I have all these credits because everything I want to buy is available. And for the most part, they're definitely not everything is available, but a lot of the ones I've wanted have been there. So, yeah.
We're good.
Like the Libby app, it's another way. If you're already paying for Spotify, might as well get the most out of it.
Yeah, and Libby's free too, but you do have to have like a membership, card to your local library.
Right.
Well, I think that's it for our show on 2001.
You want me to take us out here, Graham?
Sure.
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to Community Beer. Tonight's
next.
brewery we're
Talk
drinking.
about your second one.
Well, I didn't get a chance to drink it. I thought I'd get to it sooner, but yeah, hazeberry, blackberry, blueberry, hazy IPA. So it's a fruited beer, but looking forward to post game this one.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just send a note out, a shout out, tribute to somebody that I had the opportunity to see on many occasions when I lived in Seattle, a gentleman by the name of Shane Harrell, who unfortunately left this great world at the end of last month. He was the lead singer of this band, Bread and Butter, that I had the opportunity to actually see him a couple of different times in concert and at some record releases. And he's on one of my buddies. His band was on one of my buddies' labels. But rest in peace, buddy. Hope his family is taken care of and everything's good in Seattle for his family as best as it can be in these trying times. But if you guys would be kind enough to like us, YouTube and Spotify, and Amazon, and Instagram and Facebook and all those great platforms.
And Libby.
Yeah. Library is where you go to check out books and music.
None of us have written a book. Yeah.
Untapped.
Yeah,
Put us in your
Untapped.
Since it's 2001, put us in your MySpace top 8. That'd be great.
Like us and subscribe on all those great platforms. We appreciate you commenting and letting us know, did we miss any releases? What were your favorite releases of 2001? Did we miss any memories from 2001? Please comment below and let us know. Other than that, appreciate you listening to Texas Tracks and Taps. We'll see you next time.